it's really interesting to see a sort of repeat of the Starfield situation in 2024, right? Elden Ring Shadows of the Erdtree is hyped up to be the greatest thing in gaming, shoe in for Game of the Year, one of the best games ever made, one of the best DLCs ever made. This is going to be a big deal, and once it launches, it's a wet fart that's immediately forgotten about. Other Outside of that initial wave of YouTubers trying to gaslight you into thinking the game wasn't doing well because like, people think it's too hard, like outside of that obvious shill campaign, nobody really has anything nice to say about Shadows of the Erdtree at all, right? It's unbalanced, it has a disappointing ending, it retcons a lot of core aspects of the lore, right? Like people were not happy with what the DLC tried to do. And I think this proves it. I do think this demonstrates the problem that FromSlop is going to have going forward is that the vast majority of their audience, the vast majority of the people who played Elden Ring didn't actually beat it. And as a result of that, these aren't the people who are going to get fired up and excited about a DLC expansion. If Elden Ring was not one of the most overhyped games in recent memory, definitely one of the most overhyped games of the decade, I don't think anybody would have been fired up about the DLC at all. Because when you actually look at the metrics, when you actually play Elden Ring and start looking at the achievements, like you start realizing that, like, wow, a lot of people didn't beat the first several bosses in Elden Ring. And you know that the further you go along, there's more and more of a drop off. You know, more and more people just wander like the wastes, fighting the same repetitive enemies over and over again and slowly start realizing that like, wow, this game is not very good. And of course, they drop the game, never really think about it again. But they did buy the game. They were one of the 25 million units, 25 million people who bought the game. And so these people who don't enjoy Elden Ring are propped up as an example of just why Elden Ring is such a masterpiece. Like, oh, it's so great, it's so wonderful, it's one of the best games ever made. Well, why? Again, when you actually look at what's going on with Elden Ring, it's the same thing with Dark Souls, right? Like everybody hypes it up based on its difficulty, based on its like reputation, and people check it out, people get into it, people try to play it, and they're just like, "Oh, I don't enjoy this," and then they fall off. And then rinse, wash, and repeat over and over and over again. But with Elden Ring, what's different this time is it feels like more and more people are getting uppity at the idea that anybody could have any kind of problems with Elden Ring at all, right? So for the first several weeks after the DLC expansion came out, people were refusing to admit that the game had any problems at all. Right? Everybody wanted to like blame the players. They wanted to like say you were a casual. Never mind the fact that you had to play through all of the base game to get to the DLC, right? Like the kind of people who were fired up about the DLC were the kind of people who have beaten the game several times over and over again to begin with. Like the people who were criticizing the DLC knew what they were talking about. No, let's just slander them all as casuals. Let's just try and write off all the very real problems with the DLC in order to prop up the narrative that like FromSlop is a completely flawless company that has never done anything wrong, that produces nothing but masterpieces, and far eclipses the far more lucrative and successful Zelda IP, right? Again, this has been a thing forever, right? And I do think like it is starting to fall by the wayside, right? FromSlop cannot keep putting out the same game over and over and over again and continue to expect people to just lap it up, right? I think Elden Ring is was essentially only relevant because there was nothing else to play in 2022, right? If you were a PS5 and Xbox One fan, you have like what, maybe 7 games to choose from, all of them terrible. So of course you're going to gravitate towards the one that YouTubers are shilling as like the greatest one ever, right? But the more they do that, the more they do this, the more people are going to like realize they're going to go through the process that I went through when I played Dark Souls back in the day, that the games aren't actually fun. They're finicky, they're gimmicky, they have terrible boss designs. I remember when I played the original Dark Souls and I suddenly had this like epiphany like halfway through. It was on the Gaping Dragon, I think, in the depths, right? I was fighting this thing and I realized this thing only has two attacks. This thing can only has very predictable patterns. It's very easy to like run circles around. It's not all that dangerous. The only thing that makes the game challenging is that the hitboxes are wonky and your character can't really take any hits. That's it. When you compare it to something like Monster Hunter, which has so much better general design philosophy, way more challenging monsters, way better environments, visuals, music, like the difference is really striking as you start climbing up like the Monster Hunter rankings and start going after more and more powerful monsters. Like Monster Hunter is a better From Slop, right? Again, when you look at Monster Hunter and compare the boss fights, when you look at Zelda and compare the general like adventure and feel to it, like you realize very quickly that the From Slot formula cannot match up to any of its direct competition, right? People say it has a really unique, like fresh take on the genre, that it's its own unique thing, but that's not really true. When you look at like something like Castlevania, you get a more compact experience, better bosses, better design, more memorable characters, more of an evolution than you do in like a 100 hour long From Slot game, right? I was kind of shocked playing through the Castlevania Dominus collection, right? These DS games that are like 20 years old, like all of them are better than any From Slot game. Why? Because they have better mechanics. They have better characters, better art design, better music, right? There are actual distinguishable differences between the games, right? They actually have like build up an overarching lore and saga about Castlevania. Like From Slop doesn't get anywhere near that level of quality. All it does is like vaguely imply some things happened in the distant past and like, ooh, it's things are different now and like you're just some nobody going up and fighting against gods, right? It's like it's the same thing over and over and over again. And again, I've said this before, but like the difference between how Zelda is treated versus Dark Souls is like amazing because we were told, by the industry for years that like Zelda's just the same thing over and over and over again, when that was never really true at all. Like just compare Link's Awakening, Ocarina, Majora's Wind Waker, like none of them are the same thing at all. And yet you have like an entire generation of like 40-year-old boomers who genuinely believe that, right? And then meanwhile, you look at Dark Souls, which has had no real evolution or change at all. It's in its entire lineup. Like FromSoft doesn't really produce anything besides Souls games anymore, right? And yet we're supposed to believe these are some like innovative masterpieces, that these are like cutting edge, like the best games ever made. No. No, 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 no. Like these games are just nothing special and really should be treated as such. That's the thing that really gets me about FromSlop, is that this series is clearly running on fumes. It's running on like the ignorance of normies. It's kind of like how Game of Thrones fans will tell you that like, oh, the first four seasons were better, right? They were the ones that set up the lore and the setting and all the characters and all these great moments and stuff like that. But when you actually look at the numbers, it was like the later seasons that were more popular, because those were the series that were built up on top of the older ones, right? That's what happened to Elden Ring, right? Dark Souls was better than Elden Ring. Fanboys don't want to admit it, but this is like the ultimate debunking of Elden Ring's relevancy. Ask yourself the question: is Elden Ring better than Dark Souls? And the answer should be a resounding no from everyone, right? Like again, when you compare it to like how Zelda is treated, how like for years we went through this process of like being told that like Ocarina is better than Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, and that therefore that made all of those games worthless, and that you should only play Ocarina. even though that game is like 10 to 15 hours long and you'll beat it eventually, and then you'll want to play something else. Like, um, nobody ever really stops to think that, like, is Elden Ring the best from slot game ever made? Is it seriously better than Dark Souls, right? Is it better? Nobody really wants to like address that question because when you actually try to answer it, if you think about it critically at all, if you actually play both games like I have, if you actually like, put it to the test, you'll realize very quickly that the original Dark Souls is undoubtedly better than Elden Ring. And when you take that into consideration, that means that Elden Ring has fallen off. It is the same thing, but worse. There is no innovation, there's no change. It's the same thing, just not as polished or interesting, right? It is a straight up rehash. And when you take that into consideration, it becomes an issue of just like, why isn't From Slop innovating? Why can't they do anything fresh, new, or exciting? Why was this game that should have been their Breath of the Wild equivalent a complete and total failure, right? Why did their DLC bomb so badly? Like, where are they going to go from here? Like, the answer is FromSlop has such an obsessive cultish fan base that they cannot deviate from their established formula whatsoever. And what's going to happen is that the mass audience is going to get bored of it and they're going to move on while the core audience religiously sticks to it like no matter what. You can already kind of see this with like Armored Core 6, how some people were shilling for it because it's from Slop, but you also had like a very sizable portion of the audience who were upset that From Slop was making anything other than another From Slop game, like another Souls like, right? Because that's all they really want to see from these people, right? They can't handle anything even remotely different to From Slop. Like they can't deviate from like that specific style of gameplay because they don't really play video games at all, right? That's the reality of the current state of the From Slop fan base is that they really cannot take into consideration that other games exist and that they have value, right? Like all they do is just blindly consume From Slop and just worship it because it's the hot new thing to do right now. And what that is going to amount to is that eventually, much like Halo before it, the From Slop formula is going to meet a sudden and unfortunate end.